Hey, before we begin, if this is exactly the kind of thing you find yourself listening to in the dark, right on the edge of sleep, then welcome. You're in the right place. Take a moment to like the video if you enjoy calm historical storytelling, and subscribe if you want more, only if it genuinely speaks to you. And before we go back in time, drop a comment and tell us where you heard about this video. A friend, a recommendation, a late night algorithm that knew what you needed. We love knowing how you found your way here. Now, get comfortable, turn down the lights, and let's go back to a world that was very much alive, right before it nearly stopped being. Imagine Europe in the early 1300s, not the Europe you know from textbooks, stripped down to dates and maps, the real Europe. The Europe that smelled of bread baking in clay ovens, of manure on cobblestone streets, of river water and wood smoke, and the particular damp warmth of too many people living close together. Imagine standing in the middle of a market square in a city like Paris, or Florence, or London. A Saturday morning, perhaps, when trade was thickest. Around you, stalls draped with bolts of wool and linen, bakers calling out the day's loaves, a smith's hammer ringing somewhere off to the left, steady as a heartbeat, the bells of a cathedral tower sounding the hour, rolling out over the rooftops and rippling down through the crowded lanes below. This was a world in motion, a world growing. Europe's population had more than doubled in the 3 centuries before 1300, rising from roughly 38 million to somewhere approaching 75 million people. Cities that had been modest market towns in the year 1000 had swollen into dense, complicated urban organisms. Florence, in northern Italy, had grown to a population of perhaps 85,000. Paris had climbed toward 200,000. London, though smaller, was crammed tight along the north bank of the Thames, a city of merchants and apprentices and church spires and the constant noise of industry. The Mediterranean trade routes were humming. The Silk Road, that ancient overland corridor stretching from the Chinese heartland across Central Asia and the Middle East and into Europe's eastern ports, carried silk and spices, dye and precious stones, ideas and languages and diseases in both directions simultaneously, because that is what trade routes do. They carry everything. In the countryside, which is where the vast majority of medieval Europeans spent their lives, the rhythms were older and slower. A peasant family's year moved to the turning of seasons and the demands of the land. Planting in spring, growing through summer, harvest in early autumn, and then the long, lean months of winter that required everything you had stored, and a good deal of luck besides. Life was hard, often hungry, sometimes brutally short. The feudal system that organized European society placed most people near the bottom of a rigid pyramid, tied to the land of a lord, obligated to work it, taxed on everything they produced, bound by traditions that had governed their grandparents and great-grandparents, and would, in the ordinary course of things, govern their grandchildren too. There was very little upward movement in this world. You were born into your station, and that was largely where you stayed. And yet, for all its hardship, this was a living world, a world with sounds and smells and seasons and texture, a world where people fell in love and quarreled with their neighbors, took pride in the quality of their craft, and knelt in church on Sunday mornings with something approaching genuine hope. It was a world that expected suffering, death in childbirth, early childhood mortality, the occasional harvest failure, but not the kind of suffering that was about to arrive. Nobody in the autumn of 1346 was prepared for what was coming. Nobody had the language for it yet. Nobody understood that the world they had always known was about to end. The disease that would become the Black Death had been moving for years before anyone in Europe felt its presence. Most modern historians and geneticists trace the origin of the outbreak to Central Asia, to the windswept steppe and mountain regions near what is now Kyrgyzstan. In 2002, a landmark genetic study pointed researchers toward 2 cemeteries near Lake Issyk-Kul, where tombstones bearing Syriac inscriptions recorded a spike of deaths attributed to pestilence in the years 1338 and 1339. DNA recovered from the teeth of 7 individuals buried there matched Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for plague, placing these high mountain graves among the earliest confirmed victims of the outbreak that would eventually reach Europe and the Middle East. The disease lived, as it still does today, among populations of small rodents in the grasslands of Central Asia. Marmots, voles, ground squirrels, and the fleas that fed on them. In these animal populations, plague is what scientists call an zootic, present stable, held in a kind of ecological equilibrium. It becomes dangerous when something disturbs that equilibrium. A drought, perhaps, or a period of unusual warming that drives rodents from the drying steppe and into contact with human settlements. Whatever the trigger, sometime in the 1330s and 1340s, the bacterium crossed from its animal reservoir into humanity. And once it was in human populations, riding on the backs of fleas, moving with the merchants and soldiers and travelers who connected every corner of the known world, it became something that no ecological equilibrium could contain. It moved along the Silk Road. It rode in the saddlebags of Mongol soldiers and the cargo holds of merchant ships. It traveled the same routes that had carried silk to Rome, and spices to London, and glass to Persia for centuries, because those were the routes that everything traveled. By the mid-1340s, it had reached the territories of the Golden Horde, the western branch of the Mongol Empire that controlled the steppes north of the Black Sea. And it was there, at a place called Kaffa, that Europe's story with the Black Death truly began. Kaffa, known today as Feodosia on the Crimean Peninsula, was a Genoese trading colony. The Republic of Genoa had established it in 1266 by agreement with the Mongol Khan as a vital link in the commercial chain connecting Mediterranean Europe to the Black Sea, to the caravan routes of Central Asia, and ultimately to the markets of the East. It was a cosmopolitan, busy, prosperous place, home to Genoese merchants, Greek traders, Armenians, Jews, Muslims, and Mongol officials, all occupying the same small peninsula and conducting the complex multilingual commerce that the medieval world depended on. It was also, in 1343, the site of a military siege. The specific trigger was a brawl, a street fight in the nearby port of Tana between Italian Christian merchants and local Muslims, in which a Muslim man was killed. Jani Beg, the Khan of the Golden Horde, used the incident as a pretext to expel the Italian merchants from Tana and lay siege to Kaffa itself. The siege was a grinding, protracted affair. It was lifted once by an Italian naval relief force. It resumed in 1345, and then, in the Mongol camp outside the walls of Kaffa, the plague arrived. The Genoese notary Gabriele de Musi, writing afterward in a document that has become one of the most important eyewitness accounts of the Black Death's European arrival, described what Jani Beg did next. Faced with an army being decimated by disease, the Mongol Khan ordered the corpses of his dead, men already swollen and blackened by plague, loaded into siege catapults and hurled over the walls of Kaffa. It was, by any definition, one of the earliest recorded instances of biological warfare. The bodies landed inside the city. The inhabitants of Kaffa, already under the stress of siege, now found themselves surrounded by plague dead they could not safely dispose of, in a space they could not safely leave. The disease spread. The city descended into horror. The Genoese merchants, understanding they could not stay, fled to their ships. They sailed out of the Black Sea, across the Mediterranean, heading home to Italy, carrying the plague with them in the only way the plague needed to travel. On their bodies, on the fleas that moved between them, on the black rats that were as much a part of a medieval ship's complement as the sailors themselves. In October of 1347, a fleet of perhaps 12 Genoese ships reached the port of Messina on the northeastern coast of Sicily. When the ships docked and the gangplanks were lowered, the people waiting on the docks found sailors who were barely alive, covered in strange black swellings that oozed blood and pus. Their skin mottled and dark, some already dead at their oars. The harbor authorities of Messina ordered the ships expelled, but it was too late. The plague had already come ashore, from Messina it moved to Catania, and then inland. It reached Genoa and Venice by the turn of the year, carried by other ships that had also stopped at Sicilian and eastern ports. In the months that followed, it spread north and west with a speed that defied comprehension. North along the Italian peninsula, west to Sardinia and Corsica, and then to southern France, to Marseille and Montpellier, over the Pyrenees into Spain, across to North Africa, east back through the Middle East, that had already been struck. By June of 1348, it was in France and England. By 1349, it had reached Germany, Austria, Scandinavia, Hungary. By 1350, it had swept as far north as Scotland and as far east as Poland and the Baltic coast. A disease that had begun in mountain valleys east of the Caspian Sea had, in the space of roughly 3 years, moved across a third of the known world. The people in its path had no idea what it was. They watched their neighbors fall ill, watched the swellings appear, watched the skin darken and the fever climb, watched men and women who had been strong and healthy at breakfast be dead before the following dawn. They tried everything they knew. They burned aromatic herbs, filling the air with smoke, because the prevailing theory of the time, the miasma theory, derived from ancient Greek medicine, held that disease arose from corrupted air, and that purifying the air was the path to prevention. They fled when they could. They locked themselves inside their houses. They drank wine instead of water, because wine seemed to carry less of the corruption. They bled themselves, following the humoral medical tradition that understood illness as an imbalance of bodily fluids. None of it worked. To understand the disease itself, you have to understand what Yersinia pestis actually does to a human body. The bacterium is carried primarily by fleas, specifically by the oriental rat flea, Xenopsilla chiopes, which feeds on infected rodents and then, when those rodents die, seeks out new hosts. Humans are not the preferred host. They are simply what is available when the rats are gone. A flea carrying Yersinia pestis feeds on human blood, and in doing so, deposits the bacterium into the skin. The bacterium then travels through the lymphatic system to the nearest lymph node, where it begins to multiply. The lymph node swells, hardens, becomes a painful mass of infected tissue, the bubo, which gives bubonic plague its name. These swellings appeared most commonly in the groin, the armpit, and the neck, and they could grow to the size of an egg, or larger. The skin over them turned black. They sometimes burst. This was the form of plague most commonly seen in the Black Death, the bubonic form, caused by flea bites, producing that unmistakable symptom of swollen lymph nodes, accompanied by fever that could reach 40 degrees Celsius, severe headache, vomiting, muscle pain, delirium, and a particular intolerance to light that left sufferers unable to look at a candle without agony. Most untreated bubonic plague patients died within 3 to 5 days of the swellings appearing. The fatality rate, without the antibiotics that would not be developed for nearly 6 more centuries, ran between 30 and 60%. But the Black Death was not only bubonic. Some victims developed septicemic plague, the bacterium entering the bloodstream directly, producing a systemic infection so severe and so rapid that the skin and extremities turned black from gangrene while the person was still living. Bleeding erupting from beneath the skin, the entire body overwhelmed before the characteristic swellings had even time to form. Septicemic plague had a fatality rate, untreated, approaching 100%. Death could come within hours, and then there was pneumonic plague, the most feared form. The one that spread not through fleas but through the air itself, through the coughed droplets of an infected person, the form that moved with the terrible efficiency of a respiratory disease. Pneumonic plague struck the lungs, producing a brutal cough that produced blood-streaked sputum, chest pain, difficulty breathing, and the kind of rapid collapse that left those nearby unable to flee quickly enough. Untreated pneumonic plague was uniformly fatal. Medieval physicians, watching this unfold, reached for their theories. Paris, home to one of Europe's great universities, convened a gathering of its medical faculty in 1348 to explain what was happening. Their report, issued in the autumn of that year, concluded that the primary cause of the epidemic was a conjunction of 3 planets, Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, that had occurred in Aquarius in March of 1345, producing a corruption of the surrounding air. This was not superstition in the crude sense. It was the application of a sophisticated astronomical medical framework that had governed learned medicine for centuries. The doctors did the best they could with the tools they had. Those tools simply had no answer for what they were facing. Other explanations proliferated beyond the university halls. In the streets and the villages, people who had no medical theory at all reached for the most powerful explanatory framework they possessed: religion. This was God's punishment for human sin. The plague was divine wrath made manifest, a consequence of the wickedness of the age, the greed, the pride, the violence, the failure of the faithful to live as they should. This interpretation was not confined to the uneducated. It echoed from pulpits across Europe, offered by clergy who were themselves dying alongside their parishioners, who had no better answer and chose to give the suffering at least the dignity of meaning. If this was a punishment, then repentance was the response. And repentance took forms that ranged from the private and quiet to the spectacular and violent. The most dramatic expression of this impulse emerged in the flagellant movement, which appeared in Austria in 1348 and spread rapidly through Germany, the Low Countries, and France. Groups of men, sometimes hundreds strong, sometimes more, organized themselves into marching penitential bands, traveling from city to city in a performance of public self-punishment so intense it can be difficult to fully imagine at a remove of nearly 7 centuries. They wore robes marked with a red cross. They marched in processions, singing hymns. And at regular intervals, they stopped and performed the ritual that defined them, stripping to the waist, falling to the ground, and beating themselves with leather straps embedded with iron spikes until the blood ran down their backs and pooled in the dust at their feet. The logic was straightforward. If the plague was God's punishment for sin, then extraordinary penance might persuade God to lift it. If Christ had suffered for humanity's sins, then voluntary suffering might demonstrate the depth of repentance that the moment demanded. The flagellants gathered enormous crowds wherever they went. They offered a form of communal action at a moment when all action seemed feudal. In a world where a third of your neighbors might be dead within a year, the act of doing something, even something that the church would eventually condemn, carried a meaning that was hard to refuse. Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull in October of 1349 condemning the movement, declaring it heretical and ordering its suppression. But flagellants continued appearing through the rest of the 14th century and into the 15th because the plague kept coming back. And the need for some form of response that matched the scale of the catastrophe never entirely went away. In the search for someone to blame, the fear found other targets too. Jews across Europe became scapegoats of a particular and devastating kind. The accusation that Jews had caused the plague by deliberately poisoning wells spread through communities from France to Germany to the Baltic states with a speed that mirrored the plague itself. The logic was circular and impervious to evidence. Jews seemed, in some communities, to be dying at slightly lower rates than their Christian neighbors. This was likely due to a combination of factors: different burial practices, dietary laws that affected their relationship to infected meat, and the physical segregation of Jewish communities in ghettos that reduced contact during the worst outbreaks. But in a world gripped by panic and desperate for explanation, lower mortality looked like evidence of guilt. The well poisoning accusations ignited massacres. In Strasbourg in February of 1349, more than 1,000 Jews were burned alive on a platform constructed in the Jewish cemetery. This in a city where the plague had not yet even arrived. In Mainz, the Jewish community, numbering several thousand, was annihilated. By the time the wave of violence had run its course, more than 350 separate massacres had occurred across Europe. 60 major Jewish communities had been destroyed, and an entire dimension of European Jewish history had been permanently altered. Pope Clement VI issued 2 papal bulls explicitly stating that Jews were not responsible for the plague and forbidding the persecution of Jewish communities. The massacres continued regardless. Meanwhile, the disease itself did not pause to wait for explanations. Florence, that jewel of Italian civic life and commerce, entered the plague year of 1348 with a population of roughly 85,000 people. Giovanni Boccaccio, the writer who would eventually produce the Decameron, a collection of 100 novellas framed by the story of 10 young Florentines sheltering from the plague in a country villa, telling each other stories to pass the terrible suspended days, was 35 years old and living in the city when the plague arrived. His description of what he witnessed in the streets of Florence is one of the most extraordinary documents of medieval European history. He wrote of the black swellings appearing under the arms and in the groin. He wrote of sick people dying in the streets, their bodies going unattended for hours, for days. He wrote of neighbors refusing to enter one another's homes. He wrote of fathers abandoning their children, of husbands and wives fleeing from each other, because the breath of the sick was understood to carry death. He wrote of pigs rooting at the clothing of plague victims, discarded in the street, and dying within hours. By the time the first wave of the plague had passed, Florence had lost somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 of its citizens. More than half the city was dead. In Siena, the Chronicle of Agnolo di Tura del Grasso records something more intimate and more terrible. He wrote of great pits dug at the edges of the city and filled with the dead. So many dead that there was no time for individual graves, no time for priests to say the required prayers over each body, no time for families to observe the rituals of mourning that gave death its dignity. He buried his own 5 children with his own hands. He wrote that people in Siena came to believe that no one would survive, that the pits would eventually hold everyone, that the city itself was ending. In some communities, he was right. Historians studying the village of Am in England, which would suffer another outbreak of plague in 1665 and famously quarantine itself, have documented the complete disappearance of entire villages during the 1348 wave. Not depopulated, erased. Every person dead, the fields untended, the houses standing empty, the animals wandering free. Paris, at its peak, was burying 800 people a day. London's churchyards filled so quickly that new burial grounds had to be established outside the city walls. The Hospital of the Holy Innocents in Paris opened mass graves that would eventually hold tens of thousands of bodies. In Avignon, where the papacy was then based, Pope Clement VI found himself consecrating the Rhone River itself as holy ground because the city had run out of consecrated earth in which to bury the dead. The silence that settled over the worst affected places was something that survivors described again and again, in language that crosses the centuries with its strangeness. Not the comfortable silence of a late night or a quiet morning. The silence of absence. The silence of streets that should have been full of people and instead held only the wind and the sound of doors standing open. The silence of markets where no one came to trade, not because it was a holiday, but because there was no one left. The silence of a city that had been a living thing and had become, in the space of a few months, something much less certain. Whole families were found dead in their houses, the door still latched from the inside. Animals, pigs, chickens, cattle, wandered through the streets of emptied villages with no one to tend them. The harvest of 1348 stood in many fields uncut, because the people who should have brought it in were dead or fled. The granaries that would have carried communities through the coming winter were half empty or untouched. The winter of 1348 to 1349 was one of quiet, widespread starvation layered onto the wreckage of the plague. And then, in the spring of 1349, the disease returned to communities it had already struck, and struck them again. When the initial wave of the Black Death subsided, not because it had been defeated, but because it had exhausted the supply of susceptible hosts in any given area, it did not disappear. It became endemic, returning in waves throughout the second half of the 14th century and well into the 15th. England alone experienced roughly 30 plague years between 1351 and 1485. Hamburg, Cologne, and Nuremberg were each struck at least 10 times during the 15th century. The mortality in these recurrent outbreaks was lower than the catastrophic first wave, perhaps 10 to 20%. But each new outbreak prevented population recovery, kept communities in a state of chronic demographic loss, and ensured that the psychological impact of the first plague, that shattering of the old certainties, that reconfiguration of what life could be expected to hold, was continuously renewed and deepened. Demographically, the numbers are almost beyond comprehension. Historians estimate that between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population died in the first wave of the Black Death between 1347 and 1353. Somewhere between 25 and 50 million people in Europe alone, out of a total pre-plague population of roughly 75 million. The populations of some Italian cities did not regain their pre-plague levels until the 19th century. England's population reached a nadir of perhaps 1.9 million around 1450, compared to an estimated 4.8 million before the plague arrived, and did not begin recovering until after 1500. France and Scandinavia followed similar trajectories. The demographic catastrophe was not a single event. It was a wound that bled for over a century. Out of that wound came something unexpected. The feudal system that had organized European society for centuries rested on a single assumption: that labor was abundant and land was scarce. Lords owned the land. Peasants worked it in exchange for protection and the right to survive. The relationship was not equitable. It was, in many respects, a sophisticated form of coercion, but it was stable because the peasants had no alternative, and the lords knew it. When the Black Death removed, in the space of a few years, somewhere between a third and a half of the peasant labor force, it removed the condition that made the feudal system function. Suddenly, labor was scarce. Suddenly, the lords needed the peasants more urgently than the peasants needed the lords. Surviving peasants found themselves in a position that their parents and grandparents would have considered impossible. They could leave one manor for another if conditions were unsatisfactory. They could demand wages instead of service. They could refuse to perform the traditional labor obligations that had defined their status for generations. The shortage was so severe that the same tasks that had previously been performed as unfree labor now had to be paid for. Wages in England rose sharply in the decade after 1348 and continued rising through the latter half of the 14th century in a pattern that reflects the persistent pressure of labor scarcity. Real wages that had been stagnant or fallen before the plague reached, by 1450, levels that would not be matched in most of Europe until the 19th or 20th century. Historians call this the late medieval golden age of labor, and for the workers who lived through it, after centuries of fixed servitude, it was genuinely transformative. The lords, predictably, fought back. In England, the Statute of Laborers of 1351 attempted to legally cap wages at pre-plague levels, to prevent workers from leaving their manors, and to restore the conditions of servitude that the plague had disrupted. Similar legislation appeared across Europe. It failed, not because the laws lacked teeth, they were enforced and people were prosecuted under them, but because the fundamental economics did not support the legal fiction. If a peasant could walk 4 miles and find a lord who would pay 3 times the legal wage just to have someone to bring in the harvest, the law was a suggestion, not a constraint. The great demographic fact overwhelmed the legal structure. The resentment generated by the attempt to reverse what workers had gained produced one of the most consequential episodes of social unrest in medieval European history. In France in 1358, northern peasants rose in what became known as the Jacquerie, a violent, chaotic uprising that left dozens of noble houses burned and hundreds of aristocrats dead before it was crushed. In England in 1381, the peasants' revolt brought a column of rebels from Kent and Essex to the gates of London itself. Their leader, Wat Tyler, presented demands to the young King Richard II that read like a manifesto for the end of serfdom. The abolition of villanage, the right to rent land at fixed rates, freedom from forced labor. The revolt was suppressed, Tyler was killed, and the promises made to the rebels were broken. But serfdom in England was effectively over within a generation. The economic reality that the plague had created could not be legislated away. As the economic structure shifted, so did the social one. With peasants earning actual wages and acquiring greater mobility, a new kind of prosperity became possible at the lower end of the social scale. Survivors found themselves inheriting property from multiple dead relatives, land, goods, livestock, that in the previous generation would have passed through entirely different hands. The availability of land dropped rents. The availability of labor pushed wages up. For those who survived the plague, particularly in the decades of demographic nadir when death had removed the most competition, the material conditions of life were genuinely improved. They could afford better clothing, better food, more varied diets. They could aspire, in ways that simply had not been realistic before, to a different kind of life. The merchant and artisan classes that had been growing before the plague found new opportunities in the economic reorganization that followed. With old guild structures disrupted and old labor hierarchies destabilized, skilled workers had more leverage. New commercial arrangements emerged. Trade, which had crashed catastrophically during the worst of the plague years, slowly rebuilt, but rebuilt differently, along new routes, with new partners, with different goods changing hands. The Hanseatic League, the great trading confederation of northern European cities that had existed before the plague, expanded its influence in the decades after it, filling commercial vacuums left by depopulated areas and consolidating trade routes that had been fragmented. Cities like Nuremberg, Hamburg, and Bruges grew in relative importance as the old Mediterranean power centers struggled to recover their populations. The middle class, that broad category of merchants, skilled artisans, minor landowners, and professionals that would eventually become the engine of early modern European society, was not created by the Black Death, but it was accelerated by it. The thinning of the ranks above and below created space for a different kind of social mobility, one that expressed itself not in the violent overthrow of the feudal order, but in the slow, patient accumulation of wealth and influence by people who had previously been unable to accumulate either. The cultural changes that the plague produced were simultaneously darker and more profound than the economic ones. Art changed. Before the Black Death, European religious art had largely focused on the triumphant and the transcendent. The radiant Christ, the serene Madonna, the gold-browned heaven of Byzantine tradition. After the plague, death entered the gallery as a subject in its own right. The image known as the Danse Macabre, the dance of death, became one of the dominant artistic motifs of the second half of the 14th century and continued through the 15th. It depicted skeletons leading living figures of every rank and station in an unavoidable procession: a pope, an emperor, a bishop, a merchant, a peasant, a child, all taken by the same dancing skeleton, all equal at last in their subjection to death. The earliest surviving example of the Danse Macabre in fresco form dates from 1424 in the cemetery of the Church of the Holy Innocents in Paris. The same church whose mass graves had received thousands of plague dead 70 years earlier. It is not an accident that this particular cemetery, this particular repository of mass death, became the site of one of the earliest monuments to death's universality. Memento mori, the Latin phrase meaning "remember that you must die," became a pervasive cultural instruction. Still lives incorporated the symbols of mortality: skulls, extinguished candles, hourglasses running toward empty, flowers in the act of wilting. These were not purely morbid objects. They carried a specific philosophical instruction, a reminder that time was passing, that life was fragile, that the pleasures of the present moment were valid precisely because they were temporary. The plague had made the temporary nature of life undeniable, and culture found a way to sit with that knowledge. Giovanni Boccaccio, writing the Decameron between 1349 and 1352, was doing something more than recording the horror he had witnessed in Florence. He was constructing, deliberately, a monument to the human capacity for pleasure and story in the face of death. His 10 young storytellers, 7 women and 3 men, sheltered in a villa outside plague-stricken Florence. Tell 100 stories over 10 days. Stories of love and wit and trickery and desire. Stories that are funny and bawdy and intelligent and alive. The frame of the plague is present throughout, the horror just outside the garden walls. But inside the garden, people are telling stories. People are laughing. People are curious about each other and engaged with life. The Decameron is not an escape from the plague. It is an argument, written in the shadow of the plague, that beauty and pleasure and human connection are not less meaningful because they are temporary, that they are, in fact, most meaningful because they are. The Church, which had been the organizing force of European spiritual and intellectual life for centuries, emerged from the Black Death significantly damaged. Not destroyed, but damaged. The failure of prayer, of processions, of pilgrimage, of every religious intervention available to stop the plague's progress planted doubts that could not be fully uprooted. When the bodies of priests and bishops lay in the same mass graves as the bodies of the most notorious sinners in any given parish, it became difficult to maintain the theological position that suffering was the consequence of sin and righteousness was a form of protection. The clergy died in enormous numbers, precisely because their vocation required them to be present with the sick, to administer last rites, to hear confession, to attend to the dying at the moment when every practical instinct said to flee. Their sacrifice was genuine and often fatal. The shortage of trained clergy after the first wave created a crisis of spiritual administration. Bishops, desperate to fill parishes stripped of their priests, lowered the standards for ordination. Men who had not completed the usual years of training were admitted to holy orders. The theological and intellectual quality of the clergy declined, at least in the short term. This visible institutional failure, the Church unable to protect its own shepherds, unable to maintain its own standards, unable to explain what God was doing and why, opened space for exactly the kind of questioning that had previously been suppressed. Not immediately, not dramatically, but a generation after the plague, the questioning was there. It would flower over the following century in the mystical movements, the reform impulses, and eventually the theological challenges that would culminate in 1517 in the Protestant Reformation. Still 170 years in the future, but rooted in soil that the Black Death had prepared. The preoccupation with death that the plague installed in European consciousness had another, less expected consequence. It made people think harder about the present, about what they actually wanted, what they actually valued, how they actually wished to spend the time they actually had, which the plague had demonstrated, with empirical brutality, was not guaranteed. Historians of the Renaissance have debated for generations exactly how much the Black Death contributed to that extraordinary flowering of art and thought, an inquiry that transformed European culture in the 15th century. The causal connections are complex, and the Renaissance had roots in Italian humanist scholarship that predated the plague. But there is something undeniably present in the art and literature of the generation born after the Black Death. A quality of attention, a willingness to look closely at the human body, the human face, the particular textures of the physical world. That speaks of people who have learned, through terrible experience, not to take the visible world for granted. The public health consequences of the Black Death were, in a strange irony, among its most constructive legacies. Confronted with an epidemic they could not explain, the governments and health officials of medieval Italian city-states, the most administratively sophisticated in Europe, did something remarkable. They began to observe. They noted which practices seemed to reduce transmission. They noted that people who came into contact with the sick were more likely to become sick themselves. They noted that goods arriving from infected regions seemed to carry disease. They could not explain why any of this was true. The bacterium Yersinia pestis would not be identified until 1894 by the Swiss-French scientist Alexander Yersin during an outbreak in Hong Kong. But observation did not require explanation. It required only the discipline to record what was seen and the authority to act on it. The city of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik on the Adriatic coast, became the site of what historians consider the first formal quarantine legislation in European history. In 1377, the Great Council of Ragusa passed an ordinance requiring all incoming ships and land travelers from plague-affected regions to spend a period of isolation, 30 days for sailors and their ships, 40 days for land travelers, before being permitted to enter the city. The word quarantine derives from the Italian quarantina, or 40 giorni, 40 days. The choice of 40 was partly practical, long enough to determine whether those isolated would develop symptoms, and partly symbolic, carrying the biblical resonance of 40 days and 40 nights, the 40 years in the wilderness, the 40 days of Lent. Ragusa established its quarantine stations on offshore islands and on a headland called Kaffa outside the city walls. Ships arriving under quarantine were anchored at the islands. Their crews were isolated. Their cargo was aired and fumigated before being allowed ashore. It was a system operating entirely without knowledge of germ theory, without any understanding of how pathogens transmitted, without antibiotics or any effective treatment for those who did develop the disease. And yet it worked. Not perfectly, not always, but well enough that Ragusa's plague mortality in the decades following 1377 was measurably lower than that of cities without similar systems. Venice established its own permanent plague hospital, the Lazaretto Vecchio, on a lagoon island in 1423. Milan developed the health magistracy in 1448. These institutions were the direct ancestors of modern public health systems, the first formal expression of the idea that disease was a social problem requiring collective, institutionalized response. Beyond quarantine, the plague also pushed a slow evolution in urban planning. The connection between crowded, filthy streets and disease mortality, which had been observed long before the plague, but which the plague made impossible to ignore, gradually began to influence how cities were administered. Regulations about waste disposal, about the keeping of animals within city walls, about the management of markets and slaughterhouses, appeared with increasing frequency in the municipal records of the late 14th and 15th centuries. Not because anyone understood germ theory, but because the terrible arithmetic of plague mortality had taught even the most resistant administrators that the density of filth and the density of death were somehow related. The doctors, too, those medical professionals who had watched their entire theoretical framework demonstrate its complete inadequacy against the Black Death, began, slowly and unevenly, to change. Not immediately. The shift was gradual, contested, and never clean. But in the generation after the initial outbreak, physicians began to look more carefully at what they could directly observe. They began to write detailed descriptions of symptoms and their progression. They began to note discrepancies between what the ancient authorities had predicted and what they were actually seeing. The authority of Galen and Hippocrates and Avicenna did not collapse overnight. These texts remained central to medical education for another 2 centuries. But the seeds of empirical observation had been planted in ground that the plague had broken open. The physician who has watched thousands of people die of a disease that no theoretical framework could predict or prevent is not easily persuaded that the framework's authority should be absolute and unchallenged. Society, in the aftermath of the Black Death, became more mobile in ways that were both literal and metaphorical. People moved. Peasants, who had been tied to one manor for generations, discovered, in the labor shortage of the post-plague decades, that moving was possible and profitable. They moved to towns and cities, which recovered faster than rural areas because they drew in rural immigrants. They moved between regions, following wages and opportunities. They discovered, in the process of moving, that the boundaries that had previously defined their lives, the manor, the parish, the village, were permeable in ways they had not been before. This increased mobility was deeply unsettling to the social order, and the attempts to legislate it away were many and vigorous. But the habit of movement, once acquired, was difficult to suppress. Metaphorically, something similar happened to thought. The certainties that had organized European intellectual life, theological, philosophical, and medical, had been tested in the most extreme possible way and had, by the plainest possible measure, failed. People had prayed and died. Physicians had applied their best knowledge and watched their patients die anyway. Theologians had offered their most authoritative explanations and found those explanations insufficient. This failure of received knowledge was not, in the short term, liberating. In the short term, it was terrifying. But in the medium and the long term, it opened the intellectual landscape in ways that were consequential beyond measure. When the next generation of thinkers looked at the corpus of ancient knowledge they had inherited, they did so with a different question. Not whether this was old and authoritative, but whether it was actually true. That question, simple, devastating, generative, is perhaps the most important thing the Black Death inadvertently contributed to the history of human thought. It did not ask to contribute it. It did not care. It was a bacterium carried by fleas, moving blindly through a human world it had not designed and could not comprehend. But the experience of surviving an incomprehensible catastrophe changed the people who lived through it, and the people who came after them, in ways that could not be entirely undone. By the middle of the 15th century, 100 years after the first wave, and the generations of Europeans who had never known a world without the plague's shadow, but also could not remember the specific horror of the initial catastrophe, something had shifted. Florence, which had lost half its population to plague, had become the center of the most extraordinary concentration of artistic and intellectual talent Europe had seen since ancient Rome. Leonardo da Vinci was born in 1452. Lorenzo de' Medici, whose patronage would make Florence the capital of the Italian Renaissance, was born in 1449. The architects, sculptors, painters, and thinkers who clustered around the Medici court in the second half of the 15th century were, to a significant degree, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of plague survivors. People who had been shaped, at a remove, by the inheritance of catastrophe and the slow, hard-won knowledge that life was fragile and therefore precious. The Renaissance was not caused by the Black Death. That claim would be too simple and too neat for the complicated truth, but it emerged from a Europe that the Black Death had profoundly transformed. A Europe with more mobile labor, more disrupted hierarchies, more wealth concentrated in fewer hands among the surviving middle classes, more institutional space for questioning received authority, and a cultural preoccupation with the body and its mortality that translated, in the hands of extraordinary artists, into a new way of looking at the human form. The connection is not a straight line. It is a complicated tangle of cause and consequence, of trauma and adaptation, of destruction and the slow, persistent growth that sometimes follows destruction. What the Black Death teaches across the distance of 7 centuries is something that is both simpler and more important than any specific historical lesson. It teaches that systems we believe to be permanent are not permanent. The feudal system that had organized European society for 500 years did not survive the plague's disruption. The absolute authority of the Church, which had been the organizing principle of European spiritual life for as long as anyone could remember, was weakened by its failure to provide either protection or explanation. The medical tradition that had governed healing practice since ancient Greece was exposed by the plague's indifference to its remedies, as incomplete at best and dangerously wrong in significant ways. All of these systems had seemed, before 1347, immovable. All of them moved. It teaches that human beings faced with the incomprehensible reach first for explanation, and that the explanations people reach for in crisis reveal exactly what they most deeply believe and fear. The medieval response to the Black Death was not irrational. It was profoundly human. People blamed the stars and blamed their sins, and blamed their neighbors and blamed the bad air, because making meaning out of catastrophe is one of the most fundamental things that human beings do. The explanations were wrong. The impulse behind them was universal. It teaches that institutions forged in crisis tend to outlast the crisis. The quarantine systems developed in Ragusa and Venice were primitive, imperfect, and operating in theoretical darkness. They were also the direct ancestors of every public health system that exists in the world today. The observation that disease required collective response, that individual survival depended on social organization, on institutionalized watchfulness, on the willingness of governments to take expensive and disruptive action in the face of invisible threats. That observation was purchased at an almost unimaginable price, in the bodies of 25 to 50 million people. It is still, 700 years later, the foundation of how we think about epidemic disease, and it teaches that life persists, not easily, not without loss or grief or the long, difficult work of reconstruction, but it persists. The bells that had fallen silent in the empty cities eventually rang again. The market squares that had stood empty slowly filled again with voices. The fields that had gone unplanted were planted again. The children born in the years after the plague grew up in a damaged, altered, reduced world. And they built something in it anyway. They told stories. They drew pictures. They traded with their neighbors. They fell in love. They argued about God and money and the best way to grow wheat. They were human, in the full, complicated, stubborn sense of the word. The Black Death was one of the darkest passages in the long story of human civilization. It arrived without warning, defied every understanding people had of disease and mortality, and reshaped the physical and social landscape of an entire continent in the space of a few terrible years. The world it left behind was smaller, quieter, scarred, and transformed. Feudalism was cracking. The church, with shaken medicine, was beginning to ask harder questions. Art was learning to look death in the face, and in the rubble of the old certainties, slowly, unevenly, over the course of generations, something new was beginning to take shape, not because the plague had intended it, not because suffering produces progress in any automatic or predictable way, but because the people who survived and the people who came after them were not willing to simply stop. They buried their dead. They locked their doors. They burned their herbs and said their prayers and fled when they could and stayed when they couldn't. They did everything wrong and some things accidentally right. They were afraid, and they kept going anyway. And eventually, in the only way history ever actually moves, slowly, expensively, imperfectly, with enormous amounts of loss along the way, they found their way to the other side. The world that emerged from the Black Death was not better exactly than the world that had preceded it. It was different. It was changed in ways that no one had intended, and most people would not have chosen. But it was alive, still, improbably, persistently alive, and from that life, in the fullness of time, came the world we inherited. Let that settle around you now. Let the candles of the 14th century burn down to their stubs. Let the plague bells that tolled in Florence and Paris and London fade into the deeper quiet of a night 7 centuries later. Let the great pits and the empty streets and the creak of a ship carrying death from the Black Sea become the distant things they are, part of the long story that brought you here, to this room, to this moment. If something in tonight's journey through history moved you, or calmed you, or gave you something to think about as you drift, please leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. It costs nothing and it means everything to a channel trying to reach people who need this kind of quiet company at the end of a long day. We'll be here next time, somewhere further back in time, and just as close to home. Sleep well. You made it to morning too.